Some nurses forget their place, and I make it my mission to remind them. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before a Black Hawk landed in his parking lot. Katie Rodriguez moves through St. Michael's Pediatric Ward in Portland with the quiet efficiency of 2 decades keeping invisible. Her hands restock for supplies with geometric precision, each package aligned, each label facing forward, each movement economical and purposeful. The fluorescent lights hum above her like a distant engine, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that smells like antiseptic and stalled hope. She exists as background. Another navy blue scrub in a sea of them, moving through hallways where she has learned to take up as little space as possible, to be present without being remarkable, to be competent without drawing attention. Her patient satisfaction scores are climbing. This fact has not gone unnoticed. In her left pocket, against her pen and her penlight, a tarnished military challenge coin clicks softly when she walks. She touches it 17 times per shift without thinking, a rhythm worn into muscle memory, a ritual no one at St. Michael's understands. The coin is old. The lettering has faded from handling. One edge is slightly bent where shrapnel once struck it instead of striking flesh. She presses her thumb against that dented edge now as she stands in the hallway outside room 314, steadying herself before she enters, and for exactly 3 seconds, she is not a nurse in Portland. She is someone else entirely. Then she breathes, straightens her shoulders, and opens the door. 8-year-old Marcus Hayes sits on the hospital bed in careful stillness, his small body positioned at an angle that most nurses would consider unusual. His eyes are closed, but not the sleep closed of a healthy child. The scar tissue around his eye sockets tells the story, shrapnel from an IED in Helmand Province, 18 months ago, during an ambush on his father's convoy. Colonel David Hayes had been transporting supplies through Sanjan Valley when the explosion came. The boy was with him that day. He was 9 years old then. Now he is blind, and he is learning how to exist in a world made entirely of sound and touch and the memory of light. Katie has positioned his bed at a specific angle, 23 degrees, tilted toward his left side, with a window 3 feet to his north. The textbooks don't teach this angle. The angle comes from somewhere older, somewhere in her hands and her body's knowledge of how light moves through a room, how sound reflects differently depending on spatial relationship. She learned it 20 years ago in a place very far from Portland. She learned it by keeping a 9-year-old alive when staying alive seemed impossible. "Morning, Marcus," Katie says, and her voice is soft but not weak. "I'm going to adjust your position a little. You'll feel my hands on your shoulders. I'm going to move you about 4 inches to your right." "Okay," the boy says. His voice is small and precise. He has learned not to flinch. She moves him with practiced gentleness, her scarred hands steady on his shoulders. The scars are thin and pale, barely visible if you're not looking for them. Most of the staff at St. Michael's have never looked closely enough. The angle shifts. The light coming through the window now falls across the left side of his face, not bright enough to hurt, but present enough to feel. She has learned that blind children still need to feel the sun. They need to know where it lives in a room. "Better?" she asks. "Yeah," Marcus says, and there is something almost like contentment in his voice. "Yeah, that's better." "How did you know that would be better?" Katie doesn't answer immediately. She checks his full line, a peripheral for in his left hand, saline drip running at 20 milliliters per hour, the tubing looped without kinks. "Everything is as it should be." "I just did," she tells him. "Your body knows what it needs. Sometimes you just have to listen to it." The boy reaches out, and his fingers find her wrist. He doesn't ask permission. He just holds on, and Katie lets him, standing there in the pale morning light while his thumb traces the edge of one of her scars. "Did it hurt?" he asks. "Yes," Katie says. "But it was worth it." She doesn't elaborate. She has learned that children understand sacrifice better than adults do. They have less experience denying its necessity. Dr. Marcus Whitfield enters at 8:02 a.m., his white coat pristine, his bearing carrying the particular confidence of someone who has never been questioned by anyone with authority to enforce the questioning. He moves through the pediatric ward like it is his personal kingdom, because, in many ways, it is. He has been the chief of pediatric surgery at St. Michael's for 11 years. He has written 3 papers on surgical outcomes. He sits on the hospital board. He has connections that extend into the administrative structure like root systems, drawing nutrition from favors owed and relationships leveraged. He arrives at room 314 with 2 residents trailing behind him like satellites. They are young. They will learn to think like him, or they will not survive in surgery. This is how the hierarchy perpetuates itself. Katie is still adjusting Marcus's pillows when Whitfield enters. She doesn't look up immediately. She finishes what she's doing, a deliberate choice, a small assertion of completion over interruption, and then she turns with an expression of neutral courtesy. "Good morning, Doctor," she says. "The bed," Whitfield says. It is not a greeting. Why is it at that angle? Katie's hands remain steady. It improves his comfort and provides optimal positioning for his respiratory status. The angle reduces pressure on his thoracic cavity and allows for better air distribution. This is not entirely a lie. It is a partial truth spoken in the language that doctors understand, medical justification for something that is actually much older than medicine. Whitfield's eyes narrow slightly, calculating. He walks to the bed and looks at Marcus with the focused intensity of someone examining a problem to be solved. He does not look at Marcus as a child who is afraid, or lonely, or grieving the ability to see his own hands. "Change it back," he says to Katie. Standard positioning. The angle is unnecessary and it's creating a precedent that other nurses might follow. "Yes, Doctor," Katie says. She waits until he leaves the room, waits for the residents to file out behind him, waits for their footsteps to fade down the hallway, and then she changes the bed back, moving with precise deliberation. Marcus understands what is happening. He has learned quickly how to read the variations in adult behavior, how to sense when someone has asserted control. He doesn't like it, Marcus says quietly. "No," Katie says. He doesn't. Why? Katie's hands move the pillows back into place. "Because I suggested something he didn't think of first. And that bothers him." She doesn't tell Marcus that this is how power works in institutions. That the quietest people are often the ones who see solutions the loudest people miss. That there is a specific type of man who cannot tolerate this fact. She simply continues her work, her movements calm and unhurried, and Marcus holds on to that calmness the way a drowning person holds on to driftwood. In the hallway, Dr. Whitfield is already making calculations. His patient satisfaction metrics have been stable for 6 years. They are supposed to stay stable. Stable is controllable. But Katie Rodriguez's metrics are climbing. Last month she was at 94.7%. This month she is at 96.2%. The residents have begun asking her questions about patient positioning instead of asking him. She has not overstepped, not technically, but she has created a shadow curriculum that undermines his authority. He needs to establish boundaries. He needs to remind everyone that hierarchy exists for a reason. He does not yet understand that he is about to make the most consequential mistake of his professional life. Katie finishes her morning rounds at 10:15 a.m. She documents Marcus's vitals in the electronic medical record: temperature 98.3 degrees Fahrenheit, heart rate 78 and regular, blood pressure 98/62, oxygen saturation 98% on room air. Everything is exactly as it should be. She logs out of the computer and reaches into her pocket, where the tarnished challenge coin waits against her pen. She touches it once, twice, 3 times, and in that small ritual, she is present in 2 moments at once, here in Portland in 2024, and there in Helmand Province in 2004, cradling a small boy while the world exploded around her, pressing a challenge coin into a colonel's palm and making a promise that she will never abandon his child. 20 years later, she has kept that promise in the only way she knows how. Quietly. Invisibly. From behind a uniform that says nurse instead of warrior. Dr. Whitfield stands in the administrative wing of St. Michael's, phone all ready to his ear, and he begins to build his case. He has been doing this for so long that it feels like strategy. He does not understand yet that it is actually the beginning of his ending. The conference room at St. Michael's was packed, 30 residents standing shoulder to shoulder, all of them waiting for Dr. Whitfield to begin Thursday grand rounds. Katie arrived 5 minutes early to stock the supply cart outside, her badge clipped to her scrubs beside the tarnished challenge coin she kept in her pocket, a coin that had been burning against her rib since Colonel Hayes pressed the duplicate into her palm during their first meeting 20 years ago in the Helmand dust. She wasn't supposed to be here. Nurses weren't invited to grand rounds. But Whitfield had made a point of requesting her presence, and that alone should have told her something was coming. She stood at the back of the room, arms at her sides, watching him set up the projector with the kind of theatrical precision that only came from years of enjoying an audience. The residents quieted. Whitfield smiled, not the smile of a teacher, but the smile of a predator who'd cornered something smaller. "Let's discuss what happens," he began, his voice carrying that particular brand of condescension reserved for people he considered beneath him when staff overstepped their training. The projector flickered to life. Katie's nursing notes filled the screen in 18-point font, her handwritten observations about Marcus Hayes, specifically her suggestion about an alternative positioning technique for his next examination. The words looked small up there, exposed, wrong. Like someone had undressed her in public. "Nurse Rodriguez," Whitfield continued, nodding toward the back wall where she stood motionless, "our enthusiastic floor nurse, has suggested a novel positioning technique for the Hayes boy." Novel. He let the word hang in the air like a trap. Perhaps she's been watching too many medical dramas. Perhaps she believes nursing school somehow qualified her to redesign pediatric protocols. Scattered laughter rippled through the residence. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a sound like electricity burning itself alive. Katie's jaw tightened once, just once, and then her face became a mask, the kind of mask that came from 22 years of absorbing worse than this in rooms where failure meant people died. She didn't blink. Didn't shift her weight. Didn't give him the satisfaction of watching her break. Whitfield began dissecting her chart notes line by line, reading her observations aloud with exaggerated pauses before each critique. He called her our little innovator 4 times. 4 times. Each one landed like a deliberate cut, each one meant to register with every resident in that room that this was what happened when a nurse forgot her place. He turned to the assembled doctors and residents, all of them staring at her now, and asked them to identify her protocol violations as a teaching exercise, as if she were a case study in incompetence. "Who can tell me what's wrong here?" he prompted, pointing at her notes with the tip of his pen. A resident raised his hand. Whitfield nodded. "The positioning isn't standard protocol." "Correct," Whitfield said. "And who determines standard protocol?" "Attending physicians, sir." "Exactly. Not floor nurses with ideas." He turned a page. "Not floor nurses who think they're doctors." Katie's hands remained steady at her sides. Her breathing never changed rhythm. She was trained for this, not the public humiliation specifically, but the discipline underneath it, the core ability to absorb punishment without letting it touch the functioning parts of her. Pain was information. Humiliation was just noise. She watched Whitfield work, watched him perform for his audience of residents, and recognized exactly what he was doing, making an example. Making her the cautionary tale he could reference whenever anyone else thought about stepping outside their lane. The presentation lasted 17 minutes. It felt longer. When it ended, Whitfield said, "Let's thank Nurse Rodriguez for this valuable lesson in professional boundaries," and the residents actually applauded, not for her, but at her, at the lesson, at the correction of a nurse who'd forgotten her place. She walked out before anyone could see if she was still breathing. 2 hours later, Katie was on the 3rd floor in front of the vending machine, inserting exact change into the slot when she heard them coming. She didn't turn around, but she heard them before they arrived, heard the particular timbre of conversation that meant trouble. Dr. Morrison and Dr. Chen. The 2 attendings who'd watched her present her findings to Whitfield yesterday, the 2 who'd exchanged glances when she spoke up, as if she'd committed some profound breach of hospital protocol simply by having an opinion about patient care. So the new nurse thinks she's a doctor now. Morrison's voice carried the lazy cruelty of someone who'd never been told no. He was laughing. Actually laughing. Did you learn that positioning technique on YouTube, sweetheart? Chen joined in, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. Whitfield's got you pegged. Stay in your lane. That's where nurses belong. Katie selected her coffee, black, 2 sugars, and inserted her coins without responding. The machine hummed and delivered her cup with a mechanical thunk. She paid for the coffee with the same careful precision she'd paid for everything else in her life, every movement deliberate, nothing wasted. She could feel their eyes on her back, could sense Morrison waiting for some response, some crack in her composure that would give them material to work with later, something to laugh about in the break room. She didn't give him anything. She picked up her coffee and walked away, her stride unchanged, her face arranged in the same neutral expression she'd worn through the grand rounds. Behind her, she heard Chen say something quietly to Morrison, probably something about her being stuck up, probably something about nurses who didn't know their place, but she was already 10 paces down the corridor and already filtering it out like she filtered out the constant hum of hospital machinery, the beeping monitors, the distant overhead announcements. Noise. Just noise. Whitfield watched from across the hallway. She knew he was there without looking, could feel his satisfaction from 30 feet away. He'd positioned himself deliberately, set this up like a 3-act play, and she'd walked through every scene exactly as he'd choreographed it. That was the real cruelty of what he was doing, not that he was humiliating her, but that he was making her complicit in her own humiliation by forcing her to choose between her cover and her composure. If she'd reacted, she'd be the volatile nurse. If she stayed silent, she was the nurse who didn't matter enough to defend herself. She understood now that he was going to escalate. The social attack had been phase 1. The public dissection had been phase 2. The watching from across the hallway was phase 3, the beginning of strategic moves, the beginning of positioning allies and isolating targets. She'd seen this pattern before in command structures when someone was trying to force someone else out, when the institutional machinery was being marshaled against a single person. That afternoon at 1:14 p.m., after she'd finished her shift and changed out of her scrubs, Katie sat at the terminal in the nursing station and pulled up Marcus's file. She'd meant to just check his vitals one more time, meant to verify that his blood work from this morning had been processed correctly, but what she found made her hands go very still. There were cardiac markers in his recent labs that shouldn't have been there, elevated troponin levels, slight ST depression on his last EKG, the kind of subtle red flags that a competent attending physician would have caught and investigated before scheduling elective surgery. Whitfield was scheduling elective surgery anyway. Whitfield was planning to put an 8-year-old child under general anesthesia when there were unresolved cardiac indicators in his chart. Katie's hand moved to her pocket, found the challenge coin, and held it there. She could feel the weight of it, could feel the tarnish on its surface from 2 decades of being carried through dust and heat and places where promises needed to be kept regardless of the cost. She pulled up her phone and composed a message to the cardiology department, requesting an urgent consult for Marcus Hayes before his scheduled procedure. Then she stopped. Deleted it. Sent the request through official channels, flagging it as high priority, attaching her clinical observations and the concerning lab values. She did everything by the book, everything exactly right, everything that should have protected Marcus if the system actually worked the way it was supposed to work. She didn't believe it would. But she did it anyway. At 4:13 p.m., her supervisor called her to Dr. Whitfield's office. Katie already knew what was coming. The request had triggered a flag somewhere in the chain of command, had forced Whitfield to acknowledge that a nurse had not only disagreed with his clinical judgment but had taken action to bypass his authority. She knocked once and entered to find him standing behind his desk, arms crossed, waiting. "I could have security escort you out right now," he said, his voice very quiet and very deliberate. "Nurses who can't follow chain of command don't last at institutions like St. Michael's. Are we clear, Ms. Rodriguez?" She met his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Nodded once. Left. She had 2 degrees on her wall at home and a challenge coin in her pocket that meant more than both of them combined. She had 22 years of service in command structures where the penalties for insubordination were measured in blood, not job terminations. She had nothing left to lose and everything to protect, and Whitfield had just confirmed that he was willing to destroy her to cover his own mistakes. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that Marcus Hayes was scheduled for surgery in 4 hours, and Katie was the only person in this hospital who understood what that surgery was going to do to a child whose cardiac system was already whispering warnings. The operating room schedule at St. Michael's ran like a military strike operation, and Katie knew the timing down to the second. Marcus Hayes was booked for 13:15, an exploratory diagnostic surgery that Whitfield had insisted on performing himself, which was the first sign that something was wrong. Whitfield didn't do exploratory work on pediatric cases anymore. He delegated. He supervised. He made the nurses do the heavy lifting while he took the credit and the billing. But not today. Today he wanted his hands in Marcus's chest, wanted to be the one who found what was hiding in there, and Katie had spent the morning trying to understand why, cross-referencing Marcus's pre-op labs with a cardiac echo from 3 days ago, watching the pattern emerge like a warning no one else seemed to read. She was assigned to the 4th floor, pediatric oncology, nowhere near the surgical wing. That was Whitfield's doing. Her supervisor had delivered the assignment change that morning with an apologetic grimace, something about Dr. Whitfield's request and staffing adjustments. Translation: she was being kept away from Marcus. Separated from her patient. Removed from the one place in this hospital where her presence might matter. She took the assignment without argument, nodded without question, and then positioned herself at the nurse's station on the 4th floor directly in front of the OR monitoring display, the one that fed live vital signs from all active surgical cases. The monitor was mounted high on the wall, meant for passing staff to glance at, not for focused surveillance. Katie cleaned medication carts. She restocked supply cabinets. She moved between patient rooms with the measured efficiency of someone who'd spent 20 years making herself invisible in places she needed to see everything. At 13:12, Marcus's name appeared on the board. His vitals came through the live feed: heart rate 88, blood pressure 112/68, O2 sat 98 on room air. Good baseline. His rhythm was sinus and steady on the cardiac monitor, a flat, reassuring line of normalcy. Katie watched it flicker across the screen, her eyes never leaving the trace pattern, her hands continuing their work on the medication cart without conscious thought. The muscle memory of nursing was automatic. The part of her that mattered, the part trained in combat medicine, the part that had held a terrified 9-year-old boy while shrapnel screamed through helm and dust, that part was reading Marcus's heart like it was writing her a message in a language only she understood. At 13:21, Whitfield would be scrubbing in. The procedure was expected to take 40 minutes. A straightforward exploratory: insert an endoscope, visualize the cardiac structures, document any abnormalities, close. Routine. Low risk. Unless something went wrong. Unless the surgeon's hands weren't steady. Unless the surgeon had something to prove. Katie had worked with Whitfield for 7 months, and she'd watched him operate exactly twice, both times with an intensity that suggested he was performing not for his patient but for his own ego, for the residents and students watching from the gallery, for the narrative he was building about his own surgical superiority. The OR board updated at 13:23. Incision. The first small data point in a sequence. Katie's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She folded a blanket. She checked a medication expiration date. She did not look away from the monitor. At 13:31, something shifted. Marcus's heart rate climbed. Not dramatically, just 88 to 94, a gentle escalation that most monitors would flag as normal variation during surgery. But Katie wasn't most monitors. She was reading the pattern beneath the number, the subtle arc that suggested Whitfield was moving too fast, exploring too aggressively, maybe tugging on something that should have been left alone. The boy's cardiac system had already been compromised by the initial shrapnel injury in helm and province that took his sight. Scar tissue. Possible adhesions. A structure that looked normal on imaging might be fragile as tissue paper in reality. Her supervisor found her at 13:37, standing at the medication cart with a syringe in her hand and her eyes tracking a monitor that she had no legitimate reason to be watching. Rodriguez, Mrs. Chen in 412 is asking for pain management. Can you handle that? Of course, Katie said. She didn't turn around. Didn't blink. Didn't break focus on the cardiac trace. At 13:42, Marcus's rhythm changed. Not dramatically. Not yet. Just a flutter in the trace, an arrhythmia pattern that appeared for maybe 3 seconds and then resolved. Premature ventricular contractions. PVCs. His heart was warning Whitfield that something was wrong, that the probing was causing irritation, that the tissue was stressed beyond tolerance. An experienced surgeon would recognize that pattern and withdraw. Would ease back. Would recalibrate. Rodriguez. Her supervisor was waiting. Mrs. Chen. Going now, Katie said. She moved, but slowly, still watching the board. Her limp was more pronounced than usual, the compensation pattern that emerged when her body was braced for action, when every muscle was coiled and waiting. She'd mastered the ability to walk like an ordinary nurse while her nervous system ran at combat readiness. It was a skill learned in places where the penalty for being obviously alert was a bullet through the window. At 13:47, Marcus went into cardiac arrest. The alarm didn't shriek gradually. It screamed. Multiple alarms, all at once, heart rate alarm, blood pressure alarm, O2 saturation crashing, the sustained wail of a monitor announcing that the rhythm had stopped being a rhythm and become a flat, apocalyptic line. The sound cut through the hospital like a siren call, sharp enough to stop conversations mid-sentence, loud enough to pull every trained instinct in Katie's body toward vertical readiness. She was moving before her brain caught up with her body, before she'd consciously made any decision, before her supervisor could do anything but stare. The medication cart tipped sideways, supplies spilling across the linoleum in her wake. She didn't stop. Her legs carried her toward the surgical wing with the economical grace of someone who'd run toward worse things in worse places. The hallway, the stairwell, the doors to the OR wing, 30 seconds, maybe less. Her hands, she realized somewhere in the motion, were already opening, already moving into position, already knowing what they would need to do. The OR doors burst open and Katie crossed the threshold into a scene of controlled panic. Whitfield stood motionless, literally frozen, his hands mid-gesture over Marcus's open chest cavity, his face the color of milk. The anesthesiologist was calling times. The surgical tech was moving with practiced efficiency, but Whitfield wasn't responding, wasn't doing what Whitfield's job was supposed to be, wasn't doing anything at all. Just standing there. Just staring at the flatlining monitor. Just allowing a child's heart to stay stopped. Move. Katie's voice wasn't loud. It was lower somehow, flatter, carrying a weight that made Whitfield flinch. She was pulling on sterile gloves, moving into the surgical field, and she didn't ask permission because permission wasn't what this moment required. The boy's cardiac arrest was already 43 seconds old. Brain damage began at 4 minutes. This was the mathematical reality of hypoxia, the timeline she'd lived inside for 2 decades. The surgical field opened to her like a memory. She could see his heart, the small chamber pink and motionless, the pericardium already opened by Whitfield's initial incision. A moment, just enough time to see what he'd been doing, to recognize that she'd been right, that something in the tissue had torn, that the bleeding was pooling in the pericardial sac, that the pressure was literally preventing the heart from beating. Her hands moved on their own. The 14-gauge needle came from her fingers before she'd consciously thought to reach for it, the motion so smooth and automatic that the anesthesiologist made a small sound, a gasp, or maybe recognition. Katie was already performing direct cardiac massage, her fingers positioning around the small ventricle with a precision that suggested she'd done this exact procedure on actual human chests more than twice, her palm pressing against the boy's sternum with controlled force, her other hand supporting from below, her entire body moving with the rhythm of compression and release, compression and release. "Stop," Whitfield said. "You're not authorized." "That's not." 32, Katie said. "The count." The compressions. The rhythm that was bringing blood to a dying child's brain. Stop. She's killing him. Katie didn't respond. Didn't acknowledge him. Didn't break concentration. Her hands were steady as surgical lasers, moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd been trained for this by the military's most lethal instructors, who'd practiced on mannequins and on real wounds in real combat situations, whose muscle memory was sharper than conscious thought. The rhythm changed beneath her palms. She felt it before the monitor showed it, the heart responding, the chambers beginning to contract, the tissue remembering how to work when it was being asked the right way by hands that knew exactly what pressure meant, exactly how to ask for life without crushing the question into death. 38 compressions. 42. 47. The monitor flickered, and then. Sinus rhythm. Regular. Strong. The heart rate climbed, 58. 72, 89. The O2 saturation curve began its ascent. 72 to 84 to 91. The child's oxygen levels, his blood pressure, the electrical activity of his heart, all of it coming back online because Katie's hands had known exactly what to do. She stepped back, breathing controlled, blood darkening her scrubs where Marcus's chest had been opened. Whitfield was staring at her like he was seeing her for the first time, like someone had pulled back a curtain and revealed something he wasn't prepared to understand. The surgical tech was mute. The anesthesiologist was whispering something. Katie caught fragments. Where did you learn that? And that's not standard protocol. And under all of it, the suspended moment of silence that came when a room full of medical professionals suddenly realized they'd just witnessed something that didn't fit into any of their professional categories. Where did you learn that? The anesthesiologist's voice, louder now. Asking directly. Katie didn't answer. She was peeling off her gloves with deliberate slowness, her face absolutely neutral, the expression of someone who'd learned decades ago that silence was stronger than explanation. The tarnished challenge coin was still in her scrub pocket, pressing against her ribs, a weight she'd carried through 2 decades of lies and another decade of truth that nobody was permitted to know. Not until today. Not until her hands had made a decision that her voice would never have been allowed to make. Whitfield screamed at her to stop. His voice cracked like breaking ice. Katie's hands kept moving. The sternum compressed. Released. Compressed. Released. Marcus's tiny chest rose and fell beneath her palms, and she could feel it, that moment when electricity finds its target, when a heart remembers how to beat on its own. The monitor beeped once. Twice. Then the steady rhythm returned. Sinus rhythm. Beautiful, perfect sinus rhythm. The surgical team didn't move. Nobody breathed. Dr. Chen, the anesthesiologist, stared at Katie's hands with the expression of someone watching a ghost perform surgery. The resident next to him opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. No words came out. They'd all just watched a pediatric nurse perform open cardiac massage with the precision of a combat surgeon, her hands moving with muscle memory that had absolutely nothing to do with nursing school certification or pediatric protocols or anything that could be explained by a resume and 2 references. Whitfield's face had gone the color of old bone. He looked from Katie's hands to her face, trying to construct an explanation that would fit inside the world he'd built, and finding nothing. His mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. When he finally spoke, his voice came out thin and fractured. You stepped way over the line. Way over. Katie didn't respond. She was already calling out orders to the surgical team, her voice dropping an octave, becoming something harder and more precise than it had been 5 minutes earlier. Get him upstairs to ICU. Continuous cardiac monitoring. I want a full echo at 1400 and another EKG in 2 hours. She paused, then added with the flat certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and someone notify his father. Colonel Hayes needs to know his son is stable. The surgical team moved. They moved fast. Because something had fundamentally shifted in that operating room, and every person in it understood they were no longer taking orders from the doctor standing frozen by the instrument tray. They were taking orders from the quiet nurse whose hands had just performed a miracle, and nobody, not the attending, not the residents, not the nursing supervisor watching from the OR observation window, nobody was going to question that authority now. Whitfield left the operating room at 12:47. By 1300, his office phone was dialing a number he hadn't called in 3 years. Board member Harrison Carlisle. The one who owed him a favor from the research grant approval that had funded Carlisle's entire cardiac intervention program. Whitfield's voice, when Carlisle answered, carried the careful tone of someone calling in a debt. "We have a serious protocol violation. A nurse performing procedures well beyond her scope. Creating massive liability." Whitfield paused, letting that sink in. Liability. The word that opened wallets and closed eyes to inconvenient details. "I documented everything. I have witnesses. But I need board support before this gets to the state nursing board." Carlisle listened. Whitfield could hear him thinking, calculating how much the research program was worth versus how much trouble a disgruntled nurse could create. The answer came back quiet but certain. "I'll talk to the others. You have my support." By 13:15, Whitfield had made calls 2 and 3. Both board members responded the same way. They owed him. Research grants were still pending. The calculus was simple. A nurse's career weighed less than institutional protection. At 13:30, Whitfield called hospital administrator Patricia Glenn directly. His tone was carefully measured, the voice of a concerned physician protecting patient safety rather than protecting himself. "I need to report a serious incident. Scope of practice violation. The nurse in question performed an emergency procedure she has absolutely no training for, and while it happened to work out, the liability exposure is, he let that hang. I'm filing a formal complaint with the state nursing board. I wanted you to hear it from me first." Patricia Glenn's response was predictable. "Thank you for bringing this to me immediately. We'll need to place her on administrative leave pending investigation. This is exactly the kind of situation that destroys hospitals." By 1400, Whitfield had moved from phone calls to direct action. He pulled up Katie's personnel file and began making calls to her listed references. The first was a hospital in Seattle. A supervisor who'd worked with Katie years ago. Whitfield's voice carried the weight of concerned professionalism, the tone of one physician looking out for another. "I'm calling about Katie Rodriguez. We're conducting a routine employment verification, but there were some concerning incidents during her time here. I want to make sure we're not missing any red flags. Did you experience any issues with her? Judgment calls? Overstepping?" The supervisor in Seattle hesitated. Katie had been exemplary. But when a doctor from a major hospital calls with that tone, with those carefully weighted questions, the hesitation becomes doubt. The doubt becomes caution. The caution becomes a reference that's just careful enough to plant seeds. Whitfield hung up and called San Diego next. Same script. Different supervisor. Same result. By 1445, he'd poisoned every professional well Katie had built, and he'd done it with the precision of someone who understood that destruction is most effective when it arrives wrapped in concern. Katie's supervisor, Margaret Torres, arrived at 1520 with a manila folder and an expression that said she'd rather be anywhere else. She found Katie in the break room, sitting alone with a cup of untouched coffee, staring at nothing. "Katie." Margaret's voice carried regret. "I need you to come with me to HR." The walk felt long. Katie's badge was still active, still granting her access to every locked door, every restricted area, every place where she'd spent the last 2 months gathering evidence on the medical supply theft ring. By 1535, that access was terminated. The badge deactivated with 3 button presses and an entry into a computer system. Just like that, 2 months of deep cover work, 2 months of careful positioning, 2 months of collecting serial numbers and tracking shipments to shell companies connected to operatives she'd been authorized to identify, gone. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, and she meant it. "Administrative leave, pending investigation. We'll need you to turn in your badge, Clear out your locker. You're not permitted on hospital grounds without explicit approval from HR. Katie nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't say that she'd just saved a child's life, or that the real threat wasn't a nurse overstepping but a medical theft ring funneling controlled substances to foreign operatives, or that Whitfield was taking payments from the very people she'd been investigating. She didn't say any of it because saying it would only deepen the damage, would only make her supervisor complicit in something larger than she was cleared to understand. She packed her locker in silence. 12 years of naval special warfare had taught her that survival sometimes meant accepting losses and walking away with what remained. By 1700, Katie was walking through the parking garage toward her 15-year-old Honda Civic, and her phone was buzzing with text messages from a number she'd been trained to recognize immediately. Her handler. The ONI investigation coordinator who'd placed her in St. Michael's under deep cover. Cover blown. Extract protocols initiated. Supply ring investigation suspended. 2 months' work lost. She sat in the driver's seat without turning the key. The smell of old coffee and vinyl upholstery filled the small space. Outside, Portland rain began to fall, that soft Pacific drizzle that would eventually become a downpour, and Katie sat motionless with her hands on the steering wheel, trying to calculate the mathematics of what she'd just done. Marcus was alive. That part was true. That part was certain. She'd bought him breathing room, bought him another chance at a life, bought his father the mercy of not burying a son. But the cost was printed in her handler's messages. The supply ring would continue operating. The foreign operatives would continue receiving medications diverted from American hospitals. 12 operatives whose identities she'd documented would remain unidentified. 7 shell companies whose ownership she'd traced would continue moving money. 2 months of work, 2 months of positioning, 2 months of becoming someone she wasn't, all of it collapsed in the 30 seconds it took her to perform open cardiac massage. Her hands, which had been steady through everything, finally began to tremble. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to force them still, but the trembling wouldn't stop. Her phone buzzed again. Her handler wanted debrief. Immediate. She turned it off. The parking garage was nearly empty. Overhead lights hummed their particular frequency, casting everything in that sickly fluorescent yellow that made the world look like it was drowning. Katie sat in her car while hospital staff walked past, none of them seeing her, which was how she'd spent the last 22 years existing. Invisible. Efficient. Alone in the dark. She reached down and picked up the tarnished challenge coin that had fallen from her pocket onto the floor mat. Colonel Hayes's unit insignia was still visible beneath the patina, worn smooth by 2 decades of being carried, touched, held while making impossible decisions. She'd made a promise to that coin in the dust of Helmand Province. She'd kept it today. But keeping it had cost her the mission, had cost her the investigation, had cost her everything she'd been working toward. Her jaw finally unclenched. Something that might have been a sob caught in her throat, but no sound came out because even in total privacy, some discipline never breaks. Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez sat alone in her car while Portland rain began to hammer against the windows, and she couldn't make herself turn the key or move or do anything except grip that challenge coin and remember that sometimes the right choice and the mission were not the same thing, and sometimes you had to choose which one mattered more. Outside, the parking garage had gone completely silent except for the sound of rain on metal and the distant rumble of traffic on the city streets beyond. Inside the car, Katie Rodriguez sat in darkness and made peace with failure, which was the only victory left available to her. The Black Hawk landed at 0600 Friday morning, rotors still spinning as the Portland dawn cracked open like a shell. The parking lot of St. Michael's had never heard a helicopter before. The sound was everything, a rhythmic percussion that made windows rattle and car alarms scream, a rotor wash that flattened the flagpole flag like a man pressing his palm against someone's chest. 2 Marine guards in full kit, body armor, weapons slung, the kind of men who move like controlled explosions, exited the aircraft before the skids even settled. They didn't walk toward the main entrance. They walked toward the administrative wing. They didn't knock. The hospital security guard, a man named Peterson who'd served for years Navy intel before taking the day job, went pale the moment he saw the uniforms. His hand moved to his radio but stopped halfway there. The guards didn't speak. They just nodded at the glass doors leading to executive offices, a gesture that carried the weight of federal authority. Peterson followed them. His voice, when it came, cracked slightly, not from fear, but from the recognition of rank. He was hearing the kind of rank that made his own military service feel like a field trip. "Ms. asking for Nurse Rodriguez," one guard said to him. Not a request. Not a question. A statement of fact. Peterson's radio crackled. He keyed it with a trembling hand. "We need Katie Rodriguez. Administrative wing. Now." He paused. Then he added something that made his supervisor, standing in the hallway with Dr. Whitfield's administrative assistant, stop cold. "That's Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez. 3 silver stars. 2 bronze stars with valor. 22 years naval special warfare." The silence that followed wasn't the normal hospital quiet. This was the kind of silence that happens when a lie you didn't know you were living suddenly reveals itself as truth. The kind of silence that makes you question every decision you've ever made. Whitfield was in his office when the Admiral walked in. A 2-star. The kind of rank that doesn't have to announce itself because the room recognizes it the moment the air pressure changes. The Admiral was 63, with the bearing of a man who'd spent for decades inside military hierarchy, and he carried a file folder the color of blood, a classified document jacket that Whitfield had never seen before. The Admiral didn't sit down. He didn't introduce himself. He opened the file and began reading Katie's service record aloud like he was testifying in front of a congressional committee. Master Chief Petty Officer Catherine Marie Rodriguez. Naval Special Warfare Command, San Diego. 2 decades active duty. Deployed to Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and Yemen in both combat and deep cover operational capacities. Combat Medic Certification. Emergency Medicine Certification. Additional qualifications in trauma surgery, field stabilization, and the Admiral paused, letting the weight settle, direct cardiac intervention under combat conditions. Whitfield's face had stopped moving. His hands had stopped moving. His lungs had probably stopped moving. The Admiral turned the page. Helmand Province, Sanjin Valley, August 2005. Captain James Hayes's convoy took enemy fire approximately 6 kilometers north of Forward Operating Base Shank. 3 vehicles disabled. Multiple casualties. During the engagement, a 9-year-old child, Marcus James Hayes, the captain's son, who was on the convoy for a scheduled medical evaluation at Kandahar Airfield, sustained a shrapnel wound to the orbital region with resulting permanent vision loss. The Admiral looked up from the file. His eyes were the color of winter. "You know what Petty Officer Rodriguez did?" Whitfield didn't answer. There was no answer that mattered. She picked up that child. She carried him 3 miles. Through active fire. Through terrain that would have broken a normal person's legs. Taking fragmentation wounds herself in the process to shield his head. The Admiral closed the file. She delivered him to a medevac helicopter with enough field dressing and direct pressure application that he survived the flight and made it to surgical intervention in Kandahar with all his cognitive function intact. That boy is alive because that woman carried him through hell. The Admiral's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was the kind of calm that comes from having already made decisions that would end careers. "So here's my question, Dr. Whitfield. Here's the only question that matters right now. Why did you obstruct her care recommendations for that child? Why did you threaten her job for suggesting a positioning technique that could have reduced his post-operative pain? Why did you actively work to prevent her from staying near his bedside when she was the only person in this hospital who understood what he needed?" Whitfield opened his mouth. The Admiral raised one hand, not a gesture, a command. Before Whitfield could close his mouth again, the office door opened a second time. Different uniforms. Dark suits with the kind of bearing that made them visible before they entered a room. FBI. The agent in front held another folder, this one manila, and she moved like someone who'd spent 15 years watching people exactly like Whitfield try to explain their way out of federal charges. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, she said, and his name sounded like a curse. We have a warrant for your office files, your electronic communications, your procurement records, and your financial accounts. We have evidence that you accepted payments totaling $847,000 over 18 months from Consolidated Medical Supplies Group. We have records indicating that CMSG was operating as a front for diversion of controlled medications from St. Michael's inventory. And we have communication showing that you were aware of this activity by your signature on procurement approval forms. She stepped closer. The room contracted around her like a fist closing. You didn't just suppress a qualified medical professional's recommendations. You actively participated in a theft ring. You took money from a supply chain criminal operation. And you did it while covering your tracks by destroying the credibility of the one person in this hospital who was actually investigating them. She paused. That person was Lieutenant Master Chief Catherine Rodriguez, operating under federal direction as part of a Department of Defense investigation into international medical supply trafficking. The color drained from Whitfield's face the way water drains from a bathtub, not slowly, but completely and with finality. You have the right to remain silent, the FBI agent began, and the words that followed were the death knell of everything Whitfield had built. They placed the handcuffs on him at 0847. Stainless steel. Cold. The kind that close with a mechanical precision that sounds like a judge's gavel. They walked him out of his office, down the hallway he'd commanded for 19 years, past the nurses' station where 3 nurses pretended not to watch, past the break room where Doctors Chen and Morrison stood frozen mid-conversation, past the pediatric ward where Whitfield had shaped hospital policy like it was his personal sculpture. Every step of the perp walk was a sentence delivered without words. Every face that turned away was a vote of no confidence. Every silence was a message, you are no longer one of us. What happened next didn't take weeks. It took days. The hospital administrator released a termination notice by 1100 Friday morning, immediate suspension pending investigation, pending criminal proceedings, pending the avalanche that was already rolling. The board members who'd owed Whitfield favors suddenly had selective memory. No one returned his calls. His name was being removed from wing dedications before his attorney had finished posting bail. The state medical board opened an ethics investigation by afternoon. By evening, 3 former patients had filed malpractice suits, and Whitfield's carefully constructed network of obligation and influence was dissolving like salt in water. By week 3, his wife had filed for separation. His country club membership was suspended. The prestigious medical journals that had published his research quietly retracted 2 papers when data irregularities emerged. Doctors Chen and Morrison were reassigned to overnight shifts in the free clinic, the kind of career death that isn't technically a firing but amounts to the same thing. The supply theft investigation expanded beyond Whitfield to his entire procurement history, and every signature became evidence. Every preference card became a document. Every handshake became a potential conspiracy charge. 2 months later, someone spotted him at a strip mall off Route 26. Not at a country club. Not at a medical conference. At a folding table positioned between a nail salon and a vape shop, with supplemental insurance policy forms arranged in neat stacks, selling coverage plans to people who didn't recognize him. His hands shook slightly when he sorted paperwork, a tremor that hadn't existed before, the physical signature of institutional power converted to absolute invisibility. He was becoming a ghost in his own hometown. A man whose name returned 0 results that mattered. But Katie Rodriguez stood in dress whites at a Pentagon ceremony on a Thursday morning, the kind of ceremony that doesn't make the evening news because the people it celebrates don't exist in the public record. Marcus Hayes stood beside her in army dress uniform, 28 years old, blind but moving with the confidence of a man who understands his value, who leads a Delta Force intelligence team with the precision of someone who has nothing to prove. Both of them held the tarnished challenge coin, the one that had traveled from Helmand Province to Portland to this marble hallway lined with flags. The Chief of Naval Operations approached. The ceremony had lasted 47 minutes. This moment lasted forever and no time at all. The medals came in ascending order. Bronze Star first. Then Silver Star. Then another Silver Star. Then another. Then the Distinguished Service Medal. The chief read a citation that included 2 decades of service, alternate deployments between active warfare and deep-cover domestic operations, 37 lives directly saved through her medical interventions, and a specific courage that involved blowing her own mission to save a child she'd already rescued once. Admiral Kern, Colonel Hayes's commanding officer, the man who'd driven to Portland personally to read that service record, saluted her like she was a fellow officer. Marcus embraced her the way a son embraces an aunt who'd given him a second life. Nobody in that hallway was dry-eyed, and nobody cared. Katie moved to the microphone. The room went completely still. Her voice, when it came, carried the weight of everything she'd endured in silence. "True class is what you do when the lights go out," she said, and the room held its breath. "It's not what you do when people are watching. It's what you do when nobody will ever know. It's what you do when doing the right thing costs you everything." She was speaking about Whitfield. About the people who stayed silent during her humiliation. About every person who'd chosen institutional protection over human decency. But she was also speaking about herself, about the kind of strength that operates in darkness, that doesn't require recognition, that chooses a blind child's survival over federal mission parameters. When she returned to work the following Monday, it wasn't at St. Michael's. It was at Naval Medical Center Portsmouth, where her official title was Senior Clinical Instructor and her actual mission continued involving people and places that wouldn't be discussed in any hospital hallway. Marcus visited monthly. They never talked about Helmand Province or parking garages. They just sat together in comfortable silence, 2 people who understood that some bonds forge in fire and can't be broken by authority or time or institutional power. Subscribe to our channel. Like this video. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?